The boy couldn't see the dust devils swirling down the empty road or the sun bleeding into the mountains. His sister's small hands were the only world he knew, and when she let go, the world ended. For a heartbeat, there was just the sound of her ragged breath and the settling dust. Then the slow, deliberate crunch of a single horse approaching from the north and a man's voice, worn smooth by the wind, saying the words that would change everything. "Lord above, what's this now?" The man on the horse was Eli McCready, a rancher who spoke more to cattle than to people. The children at the crossroads had been left there like discarded cargo. One, a girl of about 9, trembling with silent terror. The other, her little brother, blind and utterly dependent. In that moment, McCready faced a choice that went beyond mere charity. He could ride on, as the harsh land taught men to do, or he could reach down and, in doing so, bind their broken fates to his own forever. Eli McCready's life was built on a simple, solitary rhythm. Wake before dawn, tend the stock, mend the fences that held the world at bay. His spread was 40 hard-won acres at the foot of the Bitterroot Range, and he liked the silence that filled it. He hadn't asked for company. He certainly hadn't asked for the 2 ghosts he now had sitting at his kitchen table, the girl staring at her hands, the boy tilting his head toward every unfamiliar sound. The girl's name was Lisa. She said it just once, like she was afraid of wasting the word. Her brother was Samuel. She wouldn't say where they came from or who left them. She just kept one hand on Samuel's arm, a constant anchor. The boy's blindness wasn't from birth. Lisa, in a whisper choked with guilt, said it happened after the fever 6 months back. He could see shadows and light before that. Now he saw nothing at all. Eli was no nursemaid. He fed them beans and salt pork, gave them blankets by the hearth, and assumed in a vague way that he'd ride into town the next day and hand the problem to the sheriff. That was the law. That was sense. But the law was 2 days' ride away in Fort Benton, and sense didn't explain the way Lisa flinched when he reached for a pot, or how Samuel's small face went perfectly still, listening for danger in a world he could no longer see. The first night, Eli lay awake in his room listening to the whispered exchange from the hearth. "Is he still there?" Samuel asked, his voice thin. "Yes," Lisa murmured. "Is he a good man?" A long pause. "He hasn't hurt us," she finally said. It was the barest possible endorsement, and it settled on Eli's conscience like a weight. Morning brought the first real crisis. Eli needed to check a line of fence in the north pasture. He couldn't leave them alone. He had no choice but to take them. He lifted Samuel onto the saddle in front of him, feeling the boy's small body tense like a coiled spring at the unfamiliar motion and the smell of horse. Lisa walked beside them, her hand still on her brother's leg, a silent tether. Out on the open land, something shifted. With the wind in his face and the vast sky overhead, Samuel's fear began to melt into curiosity. He felt the horse's muscles move, listened to the creak of leather, and for the first time he asked a question. "What does the sky look like right now?" Eli, a man of few words, found himself painting a picture with them. "It's big and clear blue like a washed stone. There's a hawk riding a thermal way out yonder, just a speck." Samuel listened, his head tilted up toward the warmth of the sun. A tiny, tentative smile touched his lips. It was the first crack in the dam. Later, while Eli worked on a broken post, Samuel sat nearby in the grass. Lisa, seeing her brother momentarily content, let her guard down. She wandered to the fence line, looking out at the distant mountains. Eli, watching from the corner of his eye, saw the tears start down her cheeks. Not the frantic tears of a child, but the slow, exhausted tears of someone who had carried too much for too long. He didn't know how to comfort her, so he just worked and gave her the privacy to break. That afternoon, he made a decision. He wouldn't ride to the sheriff, not yet. He needed to know what he was handing over. He needed to know why 2 children were thrown away at a crossroads. He rode to the nearest neighbor, Old Man Henderson, who knew every rumor in the territory. Over a cup of bitter coffee, Eli described them. Henderson's face darkened. "Heard about a family passing through a week back," he grunted. "Man and woman, wagon near falling apart. Heard they was heading for the mining camps, desperate. Also heard they had a blind boy slowing them down." He fixed Eli with a look. "Desperate people make desperate choices, McCready. You sure you want their trouble?" It wasn't just trouble Eli brought home. He brought a purpose. He found a straight, smooth branch of ashwood and spent the evening by the fire whittling it down. Lisa watched him, suspicious. Samuel listened to the scrape of the knife. When it was done, Eli took the boy's hand and wrapped his fingers around the finished walking stick. "This is yours," he said, his voice rough. "It'll tell you what your eyes can't. Tap it in front of you. Feel the ground." He guided Samuel's hands, showing him the grip. The boy's expression was one of intense, focused wonder. He took a tentative step, tapped the stick, heard the solid thump of packed earth. Another step. It was slow, clumsy, but it was independence. A week turned into 2. A fragile routine took hold. Lisa started helping with the chickens, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Samuel, with his stick, learned the path from the house to the privy, then to the barn. Eli found himself talking more, describing the color of a sunset, the shape of a cloud, the way the light hit the mountains. He became Samuel's eyes, and in doing so he began to see his own land anew. But the past was a shadow that followed them. Lisa had nightmares. She'd wake screaming and Samuel would wake confused and frightened, his hands clutching at the empty dark. One night after calming them, Eli sat at the table with a bottle of whiskey. Lisa, wide awake, came and sat across from him. The silence stretched. Then, in a voice so small it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire, she said, "Our papa said he was coming back. He said to wait right there." He said a blind boy was no use to a man trying to strike silver. The confession hung in the air, ugly and final. It wasn't an accident. It was a calculation, abandonment as a business decision. Eli felt a cold, hard knot form in his gut. He knew then this wasn't about finding the sheriff anymore. This was about keeping them safe from the man who had already proven what he was willing to discard. The turning point came with the first frost. Samuel caught a chill that settled in his chest. His breathing grew ragged, a wet, frightening sound in the quiet cabin. Eli wrapped him in every blanket they had, but the boy was burning up. Lisa was frantic, her composure shattering. "He gets like this. The fever, it's how it started last time," she cried. Eli knew what that meant. Another bout could take what little he had left, maybe even his life. Fort Benton was too far. The only hope was Doc Perkins in the small rail camp of Willow Creek, a hard day's ride. Eli didn't hesitate. He bundled Samuel in furs, mounted up with the boy clutched to his chest, and told Lisa to bolt the door and not open it for anyone. He rode through the night, the cold searing his lungs, Samuel's feverish head lolling against his shoulder. He rode not as a man delivering someone else's problem, but as a man fighting for something that was his. Doc Perkins was a weary man with ink-stained fingers. He examined Samuel in the back room of the camp's supply post. After a long time he emerged, his expression grim. "It's pneumonia. He's a strong boy, but it's tight. I can give him something for the fever, but it'll be a fight." Then he looked at Eli, really looked at him. "You're McCready, the rancher up Bitterroot Way. These aren't your young uns." It was an observation, not a question. Eli just met his gaze. "They are now," he said, and the words once spoken became law. For 3 days, Eli stayed in a rented room next to the docks, spooning broth and bitter medicine into Samuel, listening to each struggling breath. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Samuel opened his unseeing eyes and turned toward the sound of Eli's breathing. "You're still here," he murmured, and then fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. In that moment, Eli McCready understood he was lost. These children had carved a place in his life, and he would burn the world down before he'd let anyone tear them out. He brought Samuel home, weak but healing, to a tearful Lisa. The cabin felt different. It felt like a home. For a few days there was peace. They were a unit, a strange, patched-together family. Eli started thinking about schooling for Lisa, about tools for Samuel. He started thinking about the future. Then a rider came. A man in a store-bought suit, dusty from travel, with the cool eyes of a bureaucrat. He tipped his hat to Eli on the porch. "Name's Caldwell, County Social Services," he said, pulling a paper from his satchel. "We received a report regarding the unauthorized guardianship of 2 minors, Eliza and Samuel Croft. Their father, Joseph Croft, has filed a missing persons report. He claims they were taken." He held out the paper. It was a formal notice. A hearing was set. The children were to be remanded to county custody until the matter was resolved. Their father, the man who left them at a crossroads, wanted them back. The paper in Eli's hand didn't feel like paper. It felt like a live coal. The words unauthorized guardianship and remanded to county custody swam before his eyes. Lisa had gone sheet white, her hand flying to Samuel's shoulder. The boy, sensing the tectonic shift in the room, whispered, "Lisa, what's happening?" Eli looked from the terrified children to the impassive agent, Caldwell, and a cold, clear certainty washed through him. This wasn't a request. It was a declaration of war. "You have until the hearing, 1 week from Friday in Fort Benton, to present your case," Caldwell said, his tone neutral, bureaucratic. "The children are to accompany me today for their own safety and placement in a certified foster home until proceedings are complete." He reached for Lisa's arm. She jerked back as if scalded, pressing herself against the wall. Samuel, hearing the movement, let out a small, sharp cry of fear. "No." The word came out of Eli flat and final, like the sound of a heavy bolt sliding home. He stepped between Caldwell and the children. "They're not going anywhere with you." Caldwell's eyebrows lifted. "Mr. McCready, this is a court order. You are obstructing." "I read it," Eli interrupted, his voice low. "It says they're to be remanded to custody. It doesn't say you get to drag them off my land right this second. The hearing's in a week. They stay here until then." A tense silence filled the cabin. Caldwell weighed the situation. A stubborn, hardened rancher in his own home, 2 clearly traumatized children. Forcing the issue could turn ugly. He took a small step back. "Very well, I will note your noncompliance. But if they are not present at the courthouse in Fort Benton at 9 a.m. 1 week from Friday, a warrant will be issued for your arrest. Do you understand the gravity?" Eli just stared at him until the man turned, mounted his horse, and rode away. When the sound of hooves faded, the cabin's silence was deafening. Lisa slid to the floor, shaking. Samuel crawled toward the sound of her breathing, his hands finding her face, wet with tears. "He's coming back, isn't he?" Lisa said, her voice hollow. "Papa, he wants us back." The sheer terror in her voice told Eli everything. Going back wasn't just an unhappy option. It was a death sentence for their spirits and maybe for Samuel's life. Eli had 1 week. 1 week to build a case against a man who held the ultimate legal card. He was their blood father. Eli's claim was emotional, situational. In the eyes of the law, he was just a stranger who'd taken them in. He needed help. He needed a lawyer. The next morning, he left the children with Old Man Henderson's wife, a stern but kind woman who asked no questions, and rode hard for Fort Benton. The town was a bustling grid of hope and hardship, the county seat. He found the law office of Arthur Vance in a narrow brick building that smelled of dust and old books. Vance was a thin man with spectacles and a tired but sharp gaze. He listened without interruption as Eli laid out the facts. The crossroads, the blindness, the fever, the whispered confession of abandonment, the sudden claim from the father. When Eli finished, Vance leaned back, steepling his fingers. "It's a difficult case, Mr. McCready. The presumption is always in favor of the natural parent. To overcome that, we must prove he is unfit, a very high bar. Abandonment is a start, but he's clever. He didn't leave them with you. He left them at a public crossroads. He can claim he intended to return, that they were lost, that you essentially kidnapped them. His filing a missing persons report first gives his story a veneer of legitimacy." Eli felt a knot of despair tighten in his chest. "So you're saying I lose?" "I'm saying we need more," Vance said, taking off his glasses. "We need a pattern. We need witnesses to his character. We need to know why he wants them back now. Men like this don't act out of sudden remorse. There's always an angle, a debt, a benefit." He fixed Eli with a look. "You have 1 week, find the angle." Eli left the office with a lead weight where his hope had been. As he walked back to his horse, he passed the county land office. On a whim, he went inside. He asked the clerk, a bored young man, if he could look at the records for his own property, the McCready homestead. He'd inherited it from his uncle years ago and had never given the paperwork much thought. The clerk brought out a large, leather-bound ledger. Eli traced his finger down the entries. His uncle's purchase. The transfer to him. And then his blood ran cold. Filed just 3 weeks prior was a notice of contest against his deed. The claimant, Joseph Croft, the basis, an alleged prior lien from a mining supply company, a debt his uncle supposedly owed that had transferred with the land. It was the angle. Croft didn't want the children, he wanted the land. He was using them as leverage. If Eli fought for the kids, Croft would drop the land claim. If Eli ceded the land, maybe Croft would vanish again, leaving the children with him. It was a brutal, cynical negotiation. Eli rode home in a fury, the pieces clicking into a horrifying picture. He confronted Lisa that evening gently but firmly. "Your father, Lisa, did he ever talk about a ranch, about land, about a debt?" Lisa looked at the floor for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was a ghost. "He had papers. He was always yelling about papers. He said Mama's family owed him, that they'd cheated him. He said we were his key to making it right." She looked up, her eyes ancient. "He said you had something that belonged to us." The plot was deeper than Eli imagined. It wasn't just his land. Croft believed, or claimed to believe, that Eli's property was rightfully his, through some convoluted connection to his late wife's family. The children were the living proof of that connection, the human instruments of his claim. 2 days later, the first shot across the bow came. Henderson rode over, his face grim. "Ryder came to my place asking questions, McCready, asking if you were a violent man, if you were fit to be around young uns. Said he was gathering statements for the county." Croft was working the other side of the board, poisoning the well, building a case against Eli's character. Then the mail brought the formal court documents. Buried in the legalese was a devastating detail. Joseph Croft had submitted an affidavit from a doctor in Helena. It stated that Samuel's blindness was potentially treatable with new surgical techniques available back east, and that Eli McCready, by keeping him in a remote ranch, was denying the child a critical medical opportunity. It was genius and diabolical. It painted Eli as the selfish obstacle to Samuel's cure. The truth that Croft had abandoned him when he was blind and sick was being erased, rewritten. Eli felt the walls closing in. The law, the narrative, the underhanded tactics, all were shifting in Croft's favor. Vance confirmed the worst over a rushed telegraph. "The medical argument is powerful. We need our own expert to counter it, and we need to prove Croft's financial motive. Find that mining supply company. Find the lie." Eli spent the next 48 hours in a frantic, dusty odyssey. He tracked down the defunct mining supply company from the land contest notice. Its owner long dead. The records lost in a flood. It was a ghost, a fabricated debt. He found the clerk who had filed the notice of contest, a man who admitted after some pressure that Croft had paid him $10 to process the paperwork without too many questions. It was evidence, but it was thin. A bribed clerk versus a father's rights and a doctor's affidavit. As Eli rode back toward home on the eve of the hearing, exhausted and grim, he saw the smoke from miles away. A column of black, oily smoke rising from the direction of his ranch. He kicked his horse into a gallop, a raw scream of fear tearing from his throat. Not the house. Please, not the children. He crested the rise to see the barn engulfed in flames, an inferno against the twilight sky. Henderson and a few other neighbors were already there, forming a bucket line from the well. Lisa was screaming, pointing toward the pasture. He took Samuel, a man on a horse. He just grabbed him. Eli's world shattered. He wheeled his horse, his eyes scanning the darkening plains. There, a mile out, a single rider galloping hard, a small, struggling shape clutched before him in the saddle. Croft hadn't waited for the hearing. He decided to take what he wanted and disappear. And he'd taken the most vulnerable piece, the blind boy who couldn't even see which way he was being taken. Eli dug his heels into his horse, a wordless roar of rage lost in the wind, and gave chase into the gathering darkness. The chase was a blind man's nightmare. Eli could follow the hoofprints in the softening twilight, but Croft had a head start and the desperation of a cornered animal. Samuel, a small, dark shape against the rider's back, wasn't struggling anymore. That silence was worse than any scream. Eli pushed his horse harder, the burning barn a hellish beacon at his back. His entire world narrowed to those tracks and the fatting silhouette ahead. He gained ground not through speed but through knowledge. Croft was fleeing east toward the rough breaks and dry creek beds that eventually led to the territorial line. Eli knew this land. He cut across a high ridge, gambling on a shortcut that risked breaking his horse's leg in the rocky dark. The gamble paid off. As he descended onto the flat below, he intercepted them, his horse blowing hard, blocking the path. Croft reined up sharply. In the stark moonlight, Eli saw his face for the first time. Sharp, weathered with eyes that held no warmth, only a frantic calculation. "Let him down," Eli said, his voice dangerously calm. He held his rifle loose across his saddle, not aiming, but the threat was clear. Samuel, hearing Eli's voice, stirred. "Eli," he cried out, a piercing sound of pure hope. Croft's grip tightened on the boy. "He's my son, you're the thief here. A son you left to die," Eli shot back. "A son you're using like a poker chip for a piece of land that isn't yours. Let him down." What happened next was not a fight but an eruption. Croft, seeing no clean escape, did the unthinkable. He shoved Samuel from the saddle. The boy tumbled into the dust with a cry. As Eli's focus snapped to Samuel, Croft drew a pistol and fired. The shot went wide, whining off a rock. Eli's response was instinctual, precise. He didn't shoot the man, he shot the horse. The animal screamed and buckled, throwing Croft into a thorny thicket. Eli was off his mount in seconds, rifle trained on the dazed man, while his free hand reached for Samuel. The boy scrambled toward his voice, clutching at his legs, sobbing in terror and relief. Eli didn't tie Croft up. He stood over him, the barrel of the rifle an inch from his forehead. "The affidavit from the doctor in Helena," Eli growled. "The land claim, who's helping you?" Croft, pinned and bleeding from thorns, spat. "You think you've won, you're a dirt farmer. I've got a lawyer from Billings. I've got a judge who remembers favors." But his bravado was cracking, and in the cracks, truth leaked out. It wasn't just about the land. A mining company had speculative rights in the valley. Clearing out small homesteads like Eli was the first step. Croft was their local instrument, promised a cut of the proceeds. His children were supposed to be his sympathetic leverage, a way to pressure Eli into a quick, quiet sale. When Eli fought back, the plan turned ugly. Eli took Samuel home. The barn was a skeleton of blackened timbers, the air thick with the smell of loss. Lisa flew into her brother's arms. Holding them both, surrounded by the ruins of his work, Eli understood the battle had just changed venues. It was no longer a custody hearing. It was a war for their very survival, and the enemy had just shown he would burn and kidnap to win. He telegraphed Arthur Vance at dawn. The reply was grim. "Arson and kidnapping are territorial crimes. File charges immediately. It changes everything." Eli rode to Fort Benton with the children, walking straight into the sheriff's office. He reported the arson, the kidnapping, presented Croft's own boasts about the mining company as motive. The sheriff, a pragmatic man named Briggs, listened. He sent a deputy to fetch Croft from the thicket where Eli had left him, humiliated but unharmed. For a day, hope flickered. Croft was in a cell. The hearing was postponed. Then the system flexed its muscles. Croft's lawyer from Billings arrived, a sleek man named Dryden. By that afternoon, Croft was out on bail, the charges deemed a domestic dispute escalated by an overzealous interim guardian. Dryden had produced a witness, a drifter paid to say he saw Eli threaten Croft days earlier. It was Eli's word against a manufactured narrative. The law was a maze, and Croft had a better guide. Worse news came from Vance. The judge assigned to the custody case, Judge Morrow, had a son who worked as a land assessor for the very mining company implicated in Croft's scheme. There was no proof of impropriety, but the connection was a black cloud over the proceedings. "They've stacked the deck," Vance said quietly in his office. "Even with the new charges, the custody case will be heard first before the criminal trial, and Judge Morrow will decide it." Eli felt the walls becoming a coffin. He had the truth. He had the children's terror. He had a burned barn, but it wasn't enough. The machinery of money and influence was grinding forward. Dryden filed a motion to have Eli removed from the courtroom during the children's testimony, claiming his presence was coercive. It was granted. The night before the hearing, in a rented room above a stables, Eli prepared the children as best he could. Lisa was to be brave, to tell the truth about the crossroads, the fever, the abandonment. Samuel was just to be himself. "Tell them what your world is like," Eli said, kneeling before the boy. "Tell them about the stick and the horse and the sound of the creek." Samuel nodded, his small hand on Eli's face. "I'll tell them you're my eyes," he said simply. But Eli knew it wouldn't be enough. He had one last, desperate card to play. He had learned the name of the doctor in Helena who signed the affidavit about Samuel's treatable blindness, Dr. Alastair Finch. Eli didn't have time to go to Helena, so he did the next best thing. As the children slept, he sat with a lamp and wrote a letter, not to the doctor, to the medical board of Helena, with copies to every newspaper in the territory. He detailed the affidavit, Croft's abandonment, the arson, and the mining company's shadow. He asked a single, damning question. Is Dr. Finch offering real hope, or is he selling a convenient fiction to help a corrupt land grab? He sent Henderson to ride all night to the telegraph office with instructions to send it to every address on the list, no matter the cost. The hearing room was a pit of polished wood and cold sunlight. Eli sat at the back, forced to watch as Lisa and Samuel were led to the stand by a stern court matron. Croft and Dryden sat confidently at the opposite table. Judge Morrow presided, his face unreadable. Lisa spoke first, her voice small but clear, recounting the abandonment. Dryden cross-examined her gently, sympathetically, twisting her story. "You were scared and confused, isn't that right? Your father told you to wait, and when he didn't come back, you assumed the worst. This kind man found you, and he's been good to you, hasn't he? But that doesn't mean your father didn't love you. He was just lost." Then Samuel was guided to the stand. The judge adjusted his spectacles. "Son," he said, not unkindly, "tell the court, do you want to live with Mr. McCready or with your father?" Samuel turned his head, his unseeing eyes seeking Eli's location. He couldn't find him. He swallowed. "I want to stay with Eli," he whispered. "Why?" Judge Morrow asked. Samuel's brow furrowed, the effort of articulation immense. "Because with Papa the dark was scary. With Eli he tells me what's in the dark. He made it not scary." Dryden stood for cross-examination. He approached the boy slowly. "Samuel, your father loves you very much. He wants to take you to a special doctor, a man who might help you see again. Wouldn't you like that, to see the sky, to see your sister's face?" Samuel bit his lip. The lure was powerful, a dream dangled before him. He nodded, a tiny, betraying motion. Dryden smiled. "Mr. McCready hasn't taken you to any such doctor, has he? He wants to keep you on his ranch in the dark." He let the accusation hang. Samuel looked utterly lost, the carefully rehearsed truth crumbling under the weight of a promised miracle. It was then that the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A middle-aged man in a travel-stained coat entered, holding a telegraph flimsy. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on Judge Morrow. He was the court clerk. He hurried forward, bypassing everyone, and handed the telegram directly to the judge. Morrow's eyes flicked across the paper. His previously impassive face underwent a subtle but profound change. A tightening around the mouth, a flicker of what looked like alarm. He looked from the paper to Dryden, then to Croft, then to the children on the stand. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet. "Counselor Dryden," he said, his voice cool, "this court has just received credible information suggesting a profound conflict of interest may exist regarding the medical testimony central to your client's petition." He held up the telegram. "It appears inquiries are being made to the medical board in Helena about the provenance of Dr. Finch's affidavit. Furthermore, allegations have been raised connecting this case to speculative land acquisitions by the Western Dakota Mining Consortium." He fixed Dryden with a steely gaze. "Are you, or is your client, in any way employed by or in receipt of funds from this consortium?" The room erupted. Dryden spluttered. Croft half rose from his seat, his face a mask of panic. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. His letter, it had landed. The judge, fearing scandal, was backtracking at warp speed. Morrow banged his gavel. "This hearing is adjourned. I am remanding the children to the temporary custody of the county, pending a full investigation into these allegations. It wasn't a victory. It was a stay of execution. The children were taken from the stand, not by Croft, but by the court matron, headed for a county orphanage. They were out of Croft's reach, but they were also out of Eli's. As Lisa and Samuel were led away, Samuel turned his blind eyes toward the sound of Eli's breathing one last time, and his face crumpled. They disappeared through a side door. Eli stood, his legs unsteady. Vance was at his side, a hard grip on his arm. "You bought us time," the lawyer murmured, "but you also made a powerful enemy of that judge. He'll save his own skin now, but he won't forgive the embarrassment." Eli didn't care about the judge. The children were in the system, a cold, impersonal machine. He had to get them out. He had to prove once and for all that their home was with him, and he now knew exactly how to do it. He would force the medical question into the light. He would take Samuel to Helena himself, to the very doctor who signed the false affidavit, and he would demand the truth in front of everyone. It was 1,000-to-1 shot. It was all he had left. Getting Samuel out of the county orphanage required every ounce of persuasion Arthur Vance possessed. He argued to the court that a medical examination was now central to the case, and that Eli, as the temporary guardian, must be the one to facilitate it. Judge Morrow, wary of further scandal, agreed. 3 days after the hearing collapsed, Eli walked into the stark, white-walled visiting room. Samuel sat on a bench, his ashwood stick across his knees, his head down. He didn't look up until Eli said his name. Then he launched himself forward, his small hands finding Eli's coat, holding on as if to a lifeline in a storm. "I knew you'd come," Samuel whispered. "I told Lisa. I heard your walk." Lisa had to stay. It was a condition of the order, one child for one medical consultation. The separation was a fresh wound for them both. On the train to Helena, Samuel was quiet, his face turned to the window, feeling the sun's warmth streak across his skin. "Will he really be able to tell?" Samuel asked softly, meaning the doctor. "Will he know if I can see again?" Eli put a hand on his shoulder. "He'll tell us the truth. That's all we want." Helena was a city of stone and ambition, dwarfing Fort Benton. Dr. Alastair Finch's practice was in a respectable brick building near the Capitol. He was a man in his 50s with a tidy beard and an impatient manner, who clearly did not appreciate being summoned by a rancher and a blind boy. His examination room was cold, filled with the smell of antiseptic and polished metal. He examined Samuel's eyes with a lens and a light, his movements brisk, his questions curt. He had Samuel follow sounds, identify touches, describe memories of light and color. The exam lasted an hour. Then Finch sat back at his desk, cleaning his spectacles. "The optic nerves are severely damaged, likely from the high fever you described," he said, his tone clinical. "There is no surgical technique here or back east that can repair this. The blindness is permanent." He paused, looking at the affidavit on his desk, the one claiming the opposite. His jaw tightened slightly. "My professional opinion was misrepresented in that legal document. I stated there were new avenues of research. I did not state they were applicable to this case." My clerk prepared the affidavit. I signed it without reviewing the specific language, a regrettable oversight. Eli felt a surge of cold fury, an oversight. A child's future had been gambled on an oversight. "Who paid for that affidavit?" Eli asked, his voice dangerously low. Finch looked away. "My fees are a private matter, but I have withdrawn the document from the court. You will receive a letter to that effect." It was a retreat, not an apology. The truth was out, but it was a hollow victory. Samuel sat very still on the examination table, his hope of seeing the sky evaporating into the sterile air. He didn't cry. He just nodded, as if he'd expected it all along. They were leaving the office when a woman in a nurse's uniform hurried into the hallway after them. She was older, with kind eyes. "Wait," she said. She knelt before Samuel. "I watched the examination. I saw how you listened." She looked up at Eli. "The damage is to the eyes, not to the mind. He's a bright boy. There are schools in Boston. They teach Braille, they teach navigation, they teach independence. He doesn't need sight to live a full life. He needs the right tools." She pressed a pamphlet into Eli's hand. The Perkins School for the Blind. It was a slender thing, but it felt heavier than the doctor's entire diagnosis. It was a map to a future. Eli telegraphed the results to Vance immediately. The news was a bomb. With the medical fraud exposed, the cornerstone of Croft's better father argument crumbled. The mining company, sensing the rising stench of scandal, publicly cut ties with Joseph Croft, calling him a rogue speculator. Judge Morrow, now desperate to distance himself, fast-tracked the custody hearing. This time it lasted 20 minutes. Croft, abandoned by his backers and facing separate criminal charges for arson and attempted kidnapping, did not even appear. His lawyer, Dryden, submitted a terse statement that his client would not be contesting guardianship at this time. Permanent custody was granted to Eli McCready. The words, when spoken by the judge, were dry and legal. To Eli, they were the only words that had ever truly mattered. He walked out of the courthouse with the papers in his hand, straight to the county orphanage to get Lisa. The reunion was wordless. Lisa flew into his arms, then hugged Samuel so tightly he squeaked. They rode the stagecoach home, a 3-day journey. Samuel talked the entire way about the sounds of the train, the feel of the city stones, the nice nurse, the school in a place called Boston. Lisa listened, her eyes wide, for the first time seeing a future that didn't end in fear. They came home to a surprise. The charred skeleton of the barn was gone. In its place stood a new frame, raw yellow pine gleaming in the sun. A dozen neighbors, Henderson, others from miles around, were there, raising beams. They stopped as Eli and the children approached. Henderson nodded, wiping his brow. "Figured you could use a hand," he said simply. It wasn't just a barn raising. It was a welcome. It was a declaration that Eli and his children belonged. Life began again, but it was a different life. Eli ordered books about Braille from a catalog, though neither he nor Lisa could yet make sense of the raised dots. He wrote to the Perkins School. The reply was encouraging, but the cost was staggering. It didn't matter. He would sell cattle, take on more land, do whatever it took. The final surprise came from an unexpected quarter. A letter arrived from a law firm in St. Louis, representing the estate of Eleanor McCready, Eli's aunt, a woman he'd met once as a boy. She had passed, and with no children of her own, had left a modest inheritance to her only surviving nephew. It was not a fortune, but it was exactly to the dollar the estimated cost of 5 years at the Perkins School, including travel. It was as if the universe, having taken so much, had decided to balance the scales. Samuel would go to Boston in the fall. Lisa would attend the school in Fort Benton, boarding during the week, coming home on weekends. The ranch would be quieter, but it would be a base they could all return to, a true north. On Samuel's last night before the journey east, they sat on the porch. The boy had grown, his confidence with his stick transforming him. He could navigate from the house to the creek alone, reading the land through vibration and sound. "Will you describe it to me?" Samuel asked, leaning against Eli. "Describe what?" "Boston, the school, all of it. So when I get there, I'll already have a picture in my head." And so Eli did. He painted a picture with words, of bustling streets and tall buildings, of classrooms and new friends, of a vast ocean he himself had never seen. He described it all, and Samuel listened, a smile on his face, seeing it perfectly. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for the train, Samuel pulled something from his pocket. It was a smooth, river-worn stone, white as bone. He pressed it into Eli's hand. "I found it by the creek. It's the best one. It's for you. So when you hold it, you'll know I'm just learning my way around the dark, and I'll be back." Eli closed his fingers around the stone. It was warm from the boy's pocket. He had no words. He simply pulled Samuel into a final, fierce hug. He watched the train pull away, Lisa waving from the window, Samuel's small hand pressed against the glass. The ranch was silent, but the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was full of promise and memory and the certain, unbreakable thread of a bond forged at a dusty crossroads. Eli McCready turned his horse toward home, the weight of the stone in his pocket a perfect, solid anchor. He had arrived. In the years that followed, The story of the rancher and the children at the crossroads became something of a local legend in the territory, told in general stores and around campfires. But the real story was never about legend. It was about the quiet, seismic shifts that happen when a solitary man makes a different choice. Eli McCready rebuilt his barn and his life, the ranch becoming a steady beacon for the two children he called his own. Lisa thrived at school in Fort Benton, her fierce intelligence finally given room to grow. She wrote letters home every week, full of big ideas and a future she was no longer afraid to claim. Samuel attended the Perkins School in Boston for 5 years. He learned to read Braille with his fingers, to navigate city streets with his cane, and to understand that his world, though visually dark, was limitless. He returned to the ranch each summer, his ears now attuned to 1,000 subtleties Eli could never hear, describing the land back to the man who had first taught him to see it. Joseph Croft faced trial for arson and attempted kidnapping. The mining company's withdrawal left him isolated, and the testimony of his own paid witnesses crumbled. He was sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison. He served 4 before being released, after which he drifted out of the territory, his name becoming a footnote in a story of resilience he'd tried so hard to destroy. The inheritance from Eli's aunt covered Samuel's education, and when the funds were spent, Eli had saved enough from the ranch to ensure it could continue. Samuel didn't return to the ranch for good after Perkins. He moved to Helena, where he worked for a newspaper, translating the world into words for those who could see and advocating for educational resources for the blind. Lisa studied law, inspired by Arthur Vance, and eventually returned to Fort Benton to practice, specializing in family and custody cases. They never forgot where they came from, or the man who gave them a foundation to build upon. Eli lived out his days on the ranch, a little less solitary, a little more at peace. The white stone Samuel gave him never left his pocket. Neighbors noted how he'd sometimes take it out, turn it over in his hand, and smile. He wasn't just a rancher who took in orphans. He was a father who had been found by his children as much as he had found them. The legacy of that moment at dusk on a dirt road wasn't a dramatic rescue. It was a family meticulously built from the shattered pieces of 3 broken lives. It proved that the most powerful bonds are not always written in blood, but in choice, in patience, and in the simple, steadfast act of showing up, day after day. It asks us a question that resonates far beyond the historical frontier. When faced with someone else's broken moment, do we see a burden, or do we see a chance to build something new? The story of Eli, Lisa, and Samuel is a testament to the latter. If you believe in the power of such choices, hit that subscribe button. I've got more stories of impossible courage and quiet redemption waiting for you. Thanks for watching.